Mr. Pallone.
Could the ranking member inquire how much longer we intend to have this fund tonight?
I think we're close to finishing on this title, so let's see if we can do it.
Well, I know of,
You have 2 amendments, I think, or maybe
well, just, we have lots of amendments, but
to this title.
to this title. We had 2 that we were going to offer tonight, but we have half a dozen that we could offer, and I'm aware of 10 on your side that could be offered.
I don't know if that's that many.
I was told there were. They were going to be offered and withdrawn and various things.
There's some amendments that are going to be offered and withdrawn. Let's just keep going for a while, and then we'll see if we can finish. If not, we'll have to come back tomorrow and finish this title. Mr. Pallone, do you have an amendment at the desk? The clerk will report the amendment.
No. Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3200 offered by Mr. Pallone.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and circulated. And Mr. Pallone, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the Class Act. While approximately 46 million Americans do not have medical insurance, over 200 million adult Americans lack any insurance protection against the costs of long-term services and supports, and as a result, nearly half of all funding for these services is now provided through Medicaid, which is a growing burden on states and requires individuals to become and remain poor to receive the help they need. In order to address this growing concern, earlier this year, Mr. Dingell and I introduced H.R. 728, the Community Living Assistance Services and Supports, or Class Act. It's the companion bill to legislation offered by Senator Kennedy. Similar to the Class Act, this amendment would direct the Secretary of Health and Human Services to establish a new voluntary nationwide insurance program so that people with disabilities and chronic illnesses will have a cash benefit to pay for and choose the services and supports they need to stay financially, functionally and independent in their communities. The new program would be financed through new voluntary payroll deductions and not through new federal dollars. Now, I know some of my colleagues have concerns about the impact that this program could have on the budget deficit in the long term, and I'm very cognizant of those concerns, and we drafted this amendment with those concerns in mind. So we include language in the amendment directing the Secretary to take any other action appropriate to develop, manage, and maintain the class independence benefit plan, including making adjustments to the benefits paid out and premiums collected in order to maintain program solvency and ensure the program remains deficit neutral. The Secretary will have the tools she or he needs to make sure this program does not grow into a new entitlement and add to our nation's economic woes. If anything, this program helps alleviate some of those problems. As CBO noted in its analysis of the Senate help version, the class program could save Medicaid $2.5 billion in the first 10 years and possibly additional savings after that. And I should note that the Senate Help Committee's version of this proposal was unanimously agreed to in part because of an amendment that was included from Senator Gregg to ensure that premiums are based on the program's 75-year actuarial analysis of the program costs. And Gregg explained his support of the program based on this change alone, basically. Now, the amendment I'm offering includes safeguards like the one Senator Gregg designed. I think it actually gives the Secretary even more flexibility than the Gregg amendment by allowing her some flexibility in adjusting premiums and benefits. And finally, Mr. Chairman, the program we're establishing would not take effect until a subsequent law was passed establishing a voluntary payroll deduction. That means this program can't even begin until we have a mechanism to collect private dollars to finance the program. And this further indicates, I think, that the program is designed to run independent of any federal dollars. I'd ask for support for this. I know it's many people, many of our constituents are concerned about the lack of long-term care in the bill. This is something that addresses some of those concerns and doesn't cost the federal government anything. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Barton.
Mr. Chairman, I have some questions for the author or the council. You talk about a voluntary payroll deduction. How does one have a voluntary payroll deduction? That would seem to be mandatory if it's a payroll.
No, it's not. I mean, basically, it's an opt-out is the way it would be set up. But if the
it'd be set up so that it was taken out unless they opted not to?
Yeah, that's my understanding. If the council wants to talk about it a little more.
Obviously, that provision is not in this amendment because it's not within our committee's jurisdiction. But the way that the proposal is conceived, as I understand it, is much like you would decide to elect one benefit or another from your employer and have the employer you would choose whether to have the employer withhold a certain amount. In this case, it would be the federal government choosing, you would be opted into the program to provide long-term care benefits of this sort unless you opted out, and then the federal government would no longer withhold funds.
If I could reclaim my time, Mr. Barton,
It's
I just
actually
want
my time, but I'll
if
be
I
happy
could
to yield
just
to you.
stress again, nothing happens with this unless Ways and Means at some point essentially, passes a statute that sets up this, voluntary payroll program. I mean, at this point, we're just suggesting this because the actual, voluntary deduction is not under our jurisdiction.
Does the author have a concept of how large the voluntary deduction or premium would be on a monthly basis? And would it vary depending on the age of the volunteering to participate? Somebody at my age, I'm 59, would my deduction, if I decided to opt in or not opt out, be the same as
CBO estimated that it would be about $65 a month. But
it's not age-based? I'm trying to look who appears to be the youngest member.
Wouldn't it be based on your age?
well, I'm giving you, that's an overall, and again, that's just an estimate. But again, I can't stress enough that we're not actually setting this up. We're simply
Can I
suggesting.
get some illumination from the council? Is this,
Perhaps. I believe that the estimate by the CBO was for a national average, assuming an average distribution. Since we do not have a provision here for withholding, we didn't provide them with specs as to an age range or anything like this. We simply said if we had a benefits program like this. So it is my belief that the CBO 65 is what they would expect, what they would project or assume, would enroll on a range across ages.
what's the impression that the subcommittee chairman and the author of the amendment has from Chairman Rangel or Subcommittee Chairman Stark of the Ways and Means Committee about them moving a statute to affect this provision if it were to
Gentlemen,
come
you,
along? I'll be happy.
this
to yield.
was adopted in the Senate Help Bill, and they're in the same situation as we are. They have to rely on the Senate Finance Committee to actually bring about the funding mechanism for this voluntary tax. I would hope we could talk them into it. It would be a voluntary program, and under the way the Senate drafted it, which is the way we're proposing it here, it would be budget neutral, and that it would be actuarially sound.
This. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm in a quandary here because I support, and I've talked to you publicly and privately about long-term care, and Congressman Deal and I have some amendments later in the markup on long-term care and some incentives, and so it's definitely something we need to do. It's very difficult to accept something that we really haven't fleshed out, but it's certainly an idea that I support. So, I'm in a quandary on this, to be honest. I yield back. I yield to my friend from Michigan.
Again, to express my great affection for him. If you read the language of the amendment, at the second page, at page 3, you will find that the Secretary is supposed to shall establish a national voluntary insurance program, and then you will find that at page 3, at lines 9, 10, and 11, he must see to it that the program, that the benefits and the adjustments and the premiums are all to be in such balance as to, quote, maintain program solvency, and B, to ensure that the program remains deficit neutral.
But Well,
And I want to thank my friend.
reclaiming my time, I'm going to support the amendment without binding anybody on my side to support it, with the understanding that if this moves forward, there will be a hearing on this in this committee, and there will be bipartisan efforts to flesh it out. Do I have that assurance from the chairman?
You certainly have my assurance.
Okay.
It's fine with me. Well, he's the subcommittee
Okay.
chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Eshu?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of quick questions of the author. The federal government offers long-term care insurance now, and if we choose to buy it, we can, and that's as federal employees, right? Now, how does this plan differ? Is it another insurance, or is it the same? It's an insurance plan that everyone in the country can opt into if they so wish to? I'm not sure I understand how it would work.
The difference here is that this is a cash benefit, basically, that you'd be paying into it, and you'd actually get money to go out and purchase the community services.
So you have money deducted, and the government saves it for you, and
It's
then
like
when you
an
need it?
It's essentially an
So
insurance
it's a savings
plan.
account?
Yeah, or an insurance plan.
I see. All right. Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chairman?
Was seeking
Mr.
recognition?
Chairman, move to strike the last
The
word.
gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if the council, oops, you just thought you were going to get away from the table. I notice on page 1, line 18, it says, provide individuals who have functional limitations with tools that allow them to do a certain set of things. What's the definition of functional limitations? And where would I find that?
I'm not at all sure that it's defined in the term. This is an amendment to the Public Health Service Act. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank
This is an amendment to the Public Health Service Act. I'm not at all sure that it's defined in the Public Health Service Act. However, in the Social Security Act, for purposes of Medicaid, there are definitions of activities of daily living, limitations that are for people, for instance, who cannot carry out the daily activities that are necessary to function, for instance, dressing themselves or using toilets or bathing or things like that.
And would that apply, that definition apply to this term?
Technically, no, because this is in the Public Health Service Act, but to the best of my knowledge, I do not think, I don't think that the term functional limitations is defined. The Secretary would probably look to other similar laws to try to find a definition, but there is nothing in this amendment or the Public Health Service.
And is there anything in this amendment that directs the Secretary to define functional limitation?
On page 2, lines 17 through 19, the Secretary is directed to set a criteria for participation in the program, and I would assume that that would therefore direct her to define functional limitations, because the criteria for eligibility would be those people with functional limitations.
And then let me ask you another question, because I heard the word payroll deduction, but I don't see it in the amendment, correct?
No, sir. The original proposal as introduced as separate legislation and the proposal as adopted by the Senate Help Committee both have approaches toward a payroll deduction, but it's not within this committee's jurisdiction and it is not included in this amendment.
And this may not be fair to ask you this question, but I will. Has there been a hearing on the separate legislation from whence this comes?
I'm sorry, sir, I don't know. I'd have to.
Do we know if there's been a hearing?
No,
So there's been no hearing, okay.
not an argument.
If I,
If I could just continue for a
Chairman.
second.
we did have a, not in this Congress,
Yeah.
in the previous.
I appreciate that. That's a little different drill. And so I guess my question would be, if we pass this language into this bill, the payroll deduction piece does not exist, correct? And so Ways and Means has already met and marked up this bill.
Yes, sir.
And did they include, they did not include
No.
anything related to the voluntary payroll deduction piece?
No, sir. And so the effect of adopting this legislation would be to authorize such a program, but not provide the funding, not to have.
So it's only a partial sort of part of the bill. I'm going to yield now to the gentleman, Dr. Burgess from Texas, the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This kind of reminds me of a Christmas club back when I was a kid. You put some money away each month. You're not paid any interest on it. There's no insurance on the account, but you have the good faith that by Christmas time it'll be there for you and it will have accumulated some value. Despite what my ranking member says, I'm going to reserve the right to oppose this amendment because one of the biggest unfunded liabilities we have in the Medicaid system is our long-term care obligation to people who are my age and who will be Medicare eligible in 10 or 15 years' time. The fact of the matter is we are really not doing enough to prepare ourselves for that pig coming down the python. And I worry that this type of legislation will give people a false sense of security that they have addressed the problem when in fact they have not. I'm also worried about just as already Mr. Walden's already appropriately pointed out, that there's no numbers filed in the bill. We don't know if it did become a payroll deduction, what amounts are there, whether or not it is age adjusted, what the amount of the payout would be when the time comes, what the parameters for the payout would be. So I've got some serious reservations about us doing this and then patting ourselves on the back and say, well, we've done a good job. There is no one who believes in private long-term care insurance more than I do. I've had it for years. I believe it is the right thing to do. I think it is the correct response of my generation to that generation that is coming after us. I'm afraid that by adopting this amendment, my generation will then say, well, we've done our due, we're now doing a payroll deduction, when in fact we may have solved no problem at all. I thank the gentleman from Oregon for yielding. I'll yield back to him.
Well, the time has expired. Are we ready for a vote?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Mr. Deal.
I'd like to ask Council a question. Council, I would direct your attention to page 2, beginning on line 15. It says that the Secretary shall develop this plan in an actuarially sound manner, and then it goes on to say in the number 1 underneath that participation should not be restricted, should not restrict eligibility based on underwriting. Now, does that mean then that if somebody has well, first of all, does it mean that only those who have elected to have voluntarily withheld funds are eligible for the program?
I would understand page 1, line 14 to say that the program must be a national voluntary insurance program, and consequently, yes, sir.
So you'd have to voluntarily have had withholdings from your paycheck in order to be eligible to participate.
Yes, sir.
But since it is not restricted to be based on underwriting, that would mean then that the amount that an individual has had withheld would not determine their eligibility to participate in the program to the same level of benefits as someone who had participated to a higher amount of financial contribution. Is that correct?
I believe that by page 2, line 21, where the Secretary is to establish benefit levels, that is left up to the Secretary to do. So that it could be as you describe, or it could be that the Secretary is empowered. I believe the Secretary is empowered to set differential levels too. So
you could have paid in for only 1 month and still be eligible to participate in the program.
If the Secretary structured the program and the benefit level in that fashion.
Well, he would be ordered to make sure that it is not restricted on eligibility based on underwriting.
Gentlemen, yield to me. You just raised a good point, and I asked Mr. Pallone's counsel, how can you have a program without underwriting? As soon as you need to go to a nursing home, you sign up in the program. And he pointed out to me that there would be a requirement for vesting. You'd have to pay into the program for a certain period of time before you'd be able to get any benefits out of the program.
Well, I appreciate the chairman's explanation. It just doesn't seem to jive with the language that I see here. If you don't restrict eligibility based on underwriting, then I don't see how you make it actuarially sound or how you make a differentiation between people who've paid in for a long period of time versus those who've only paid into a short period of time. Perhaps,
The gentleman yields.
perhaps as counsel indicates, that the benefit levels under section 3 there might be at a different benefit level.
If the gentleman would yield, I mean, that's
Yes.
essentially what we're doing with 2, establishing criteria for eligibility for benefits, which would mean that you'd have to be, paying in for a certain period of time, establish benefit levels, mechanisms. So all these things about how much you pay in, what your functional problems are, all those would determine, whether you receive benefits and when, and how much you paid into it. I mean, that's what these are all meant to establish.
Well, as we all know, one of the things that insurance programs, and this is basically an insurance program, is to try to avoid adverse selection. And it seems to me that this is wide open for adverse selection to take place and, in effect, make the entire program not financially solvent. I support the concept, quite frankly. I'm like the ranking member. I think I would like to see us have programs of this type. I have serious doubts about the language being adequate to address the problem that we're trying to solve.
Well, if the gentleman would yield, I mean, let me say, we adopted the language that's on page 3 specifically to deal with that. And again, this goes back to the Gregg Amendment in the Senate, where, we're saying that, that the Secretary would make adjustments to benefits paid out and premiums collected in order to maintain program solvency, ensure the program remains deficit neutral. That language is specifically put in there to make sure that happens over the life of the program. That's why we have that language.
I understand that part. I'm just not sure it reconciles with the earlier part, but I yield back. Thank you.
I move to strike last word.
Mr. Blunt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to Dr. Burgess's point, which I'm more concerned about now than I was when he made it, as I heard the explanation here. I'd ask the author, how would you know what the benefit of this plan was when you signed up for it?
Well, we're not, again, as I say, we're not specifying that now. We're asking that the Secretary would develop that. I mean, that's got to be done by regulation and by the Secretary's action. But when you sign up, you would know because the regulations would specify.
Would be, and is there anything here that would protect you in having to spend down so that you wouldn't go from Medicare to Medicaid or any of the other incentives that seem to me to make more sense in encouraging moving into long-term care?
I mean, the whole purpose, I don't know if this answers your question, but the whole purpose of this is basically to have some kind of cash payment that you could use to buy services, and it essentially avoids the problem that you have with Medicaid now where you have to spend down. And that's why the CBO said there's significant savings in Medicaid to the point of $2.5 billion, because people would have the money to pay for these services. They wouldn't have to spend down the way we do now under the existing Medicaid program.
Well, reclaim my time unless Dr. Burgess is right, and all this does is convince you that you've got a benefit you really don't have. I know there's one estimate out there from some group that maybe this would be no more than 12%, and they're likely, I think this is from the American Council of Life Insurance or something we all got today. I'd like the ranking member and our subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Deal, I'd like to see us do something on long-term care, but I think there are things that would be create more incentives to encourage the states to work with us so that you didn't have to do the Medicare spend down totally to get into Medicaid if you had planned appropriately, and I don't see any of that here, and I'll oppose this amendment, but I will.
If the gentleman would yield.
Yes, I would yield.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to make it clear that, this is not, you understand, it's not paying for nursing home care. It's paying for, services that you would buy to keep you at home, essentially.
It couldn't pay for nursing home care?
No. The whole idea here is to prevent institutionalization. People don't have to go to nursing home, don't have to go to hospital. They stay home. They live independently. That's why, the cost is not as high as you might imagine, because it's not paying for that institutional care. And I mean, I listened to what Dr. Burgess said, and I appreciate the fact that you don't want people to have high expectations that, we're doing something that we're not. But I also think that since we're really not doing anything else, something like this, which is a voluntary program and does encourage people to be able to stay at home and provide benefits so that they can, I mean, it would be real in that sense, and it would achieve not only savings in Medicaid because people wouldn't have to be institutionalized, but also a better quality of life.
Now, would the gentleman yield?
I would.
I thank the gentleman. I thank
Yes,
the
I
gentleman
would.
from Missouri. I wanted to ask the author a question. Do you, Mr. Pallone, do you envision then that this withhold, you say it's on a voluntary basis, but would have to be an opt-out, do you envision that this money would be invested in an individual personal account, or do you think that this money would be invested in, say, like the Medicare Trust Fund that's currently probably earning 25 basis points or 1/4% return?
It is a trust.
How do you
It's
envision?
a trust account, not individual.
It would be in a,
Right.
in a trust account, earning current rates, which are probably less than 1%. So you don't envision this money, an individual being able to say, I want my withhold to be invested, maybe a small percentage of my withhold to be invested in an individual personal account with a far greater
I mean, the
rate of
idea
return?
would be at a trust fund, and people would only be able to take advantage of the program if they had functional limitations, if they had chronic illness, if they were unable to, take care of themselves, essentially needed care.
And the gentleman suggests this would cost maybe $65 a month, hoping you wouldn't have to go to a nursing home for.
Well, that's not my estimate, that's CBO's. But again, if you think about it, when you talk about community services, services that avoid institutionalization, they are a lot cheaper than, a hospital or a nursing home.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Dingell.
The requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized.
There's a great axiom in the gunsmithing trade: when all else fails, read the instructions. And I think here what I ought to do is to read some of the language that we've got. It's been reported it's going to be $65 a month in premiums. Now, the purpose of this program says the Secretary shall establish a national voluntary insurance program to be known as the Class Independence Benefit Plan for purchasing community living assistance services and reports. That's at the first page, lines 13 through 16. Then it says, such program shall provide individuals who have functional limitations with tools that will allow them to maintain their personal and financial independence, to live in a community through a new financing strategy for community living assistance and supports. And then the Secretary is instructed to establish an infrastructure that will help the nation's community living assistance service and supports needs. And then there's some other chores that he has given, but doesn't change the basic purposes set forth. Then it says, the Secretary shall develop the Class Independence Benefit Plan in an actuarial sound manner and set criteria for participation in the Class Independence Plan that do not restrict eligibility based on underwriting. He shall establish the criteria for eligibility for benefits, establish benefits levels, establish mechanisms for collecting and distributing payments, and provide the mechanisms to assist beneficiaries in the use of the benefits. Now, I'm reading from the language of the amendment. Then he's directed to promulgate such regulations as are necessary to carry out the class program in accordance with this title. And then then under 7, to take any other action appropriate to develop, manage, and maintain the Class Independence Benefit Program, including making adjustments to benefits paid out and premiums collected in order to, and then this is the language I read earlier, maintain program solvency and ensure the program remains deficit neutral. And then he's required to report. There's nothing here to frighten anybody. I'm just reading you my dear friends and colleagues, the language of the amendment, which should be a great source of comfort. It's voluntary. They don't have to do it. It's got to be actuarially sound, and the Secretary has given clear instructions as to how he's to administer it, and to keep it actuarially sound and deficit neutral.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield.
On that point number 7, that's what concerns me the most, my friend, that you include making adjustments to a benefit paid out and premiums collected in. You could start into this program and not know what benefit you were going to get or what premium you were going to pay as you got into it, because the Secretary would consistently be able to adjust it to keep it actuarially sound. It just seems to me it's a big step to take without any at 20 till 12 at night without having the hearing on it, and I think it is not comforting. I think it's actually just the opposite, not to know what those adjustments would be when you decide you want to enter into the program. But I yield back.
Reclaiming my time and with great affection for the gentleman, I read the language the gentleman refers to earlier, but the Secretary is instructed to do certain things, including establishing the program and criteria for eligibility, benefits, establish benefit levels, and do a bunch of other things to create the plan. And in doing so, he is instructed to maintain program solvency, ensure the program remains deficit neutral, and in order to do that under 7, he's instructed to make adjustments to benefits paid out and premiums collected in order to assure program solvency and that the program remains deficit neutral. What we're trying to do is to set up something that's not going to cost the taxpaying public anything, but rather to see to it that we have a program that takes care of the particular concern. Now, there's 2 other points that are important here. First of all, it has been said that it will save, and this is the Congressional Budget Office, it'll save about $2 billion to Medicaid. And second of all, they have pointed out that this program here will be voluntary and will enable the people here to begin to finally live on their own and to get around the drawdown that has been a matter of concern to my colleagues on the committee.
Gentleman's time has expired. How many members wish to speak on this proposal? 1, 2, 3, 4. Would you be willing each to take 2 minutes each?
I will. I'll agree to that.
Okay, 2 minutes to each of you. Mr. Stearns first.
Well, I would say to the, strike the last word, requisite number of words. I would say to the gentleman from Michigan, tell me what federal government program is actuarially sound. Tell me one in this country. You know, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. I mean, all of those are not actuarially sound, and you keep saying that this is going to be. Now, the gentleman from Michigan mentions all the cost savings to Medicare. How can you possibly talk about cost savings when you don't know what the premiums are, you don't know what the benefits are, you don't even know anything about the payroll? And in fact, this is a tax because you've got to opt out. And
With
so
the gentleman,
average Joe sits there and he doesn't know that he's being taxed.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I'm just saying here, you've got something that is a sort of amorphous type of bill that's really not in our jurisdiction, and you're asking us to swallow this thing here when you're saying it's going to be actuarially sound. We have no proof that anywhere in the government are they actuarially sound, and there's no benefits that are outlined. So we don't know anything that Mr. Dingle indicates that's true benefit to Medicare or Medicaid, anybody. And lastly, I tell my colleagues, you don't want to force a person to go into a program, and it's just basically a mandatory. You're in the program, you've got to have the will and wherewithal to get opt-out, and you don't even know what kind of benefits you're getting. So I think it's a bad bill.
Gentleman is yielding back his time. Who is next? Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Danny Davis and I have dropped a bill many years now called MICASA. It's changed its name. But the basic premise was Medicaid disability money follows the individual. And the premise is the same thing as the premise of this, is if we had to keep people in their home, they wouldn't be in institutional care, and you use that Medicaid dollars to help offset the attendant care, we're all winners. And I think that's a better option, and that's really a freedom option instead of forcing people into institutional care. Now Senator Harkin had the bill on the Senate side, and I think that is a respectful way to help people really determine their own lives. And I wish we would look at that versus this. I would rather incentivize the private sector through a tax incentive and payroll deduction, and like deferred compensation plan, where you get the tax benefit and then you incentivize the private sector. Because I again also I have the same type of problems. I think the money is going to go like everywhere else we go. It's going to go to the U.S. Treasury, and it's going to offset our it's going to be income generated until we have to pay it out, and it's going to be like the Nuclear Waste Fund or the Social Security Trust Fund. There's no trust funds. The Highway Trust Fund, you name it, that's where this is going to go, and that's why I'll vote no. But if we would like to work on Medicaid dollars following the individual and not incentivizing institutional care and freeing up the disabled to choose the areas where they want to live and how they want to live, I'm willing to work with you. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Who is next? Mr. Boyer.
Well, I have the CBO letter in my hand, and I'm surprised no one's even talking about the CBO letter. CBO has expressed some pretty strong concerns about what you're proposing, Mr. Pallone. And I guess when you look at your legislation, I have to ask this question. In the CBO letter, they talk about the average premium would be limited to $65 per month in 2011 and indexed for inflation. I don't know where they're getting these numbers and how they're setting this up. I mean, when you give us this amendment, we don't know, but you must already know and assume of some type of a program because CBO scored it. And so even when the chairman had a question, the chairman was even unaware that you had a 5-year vesting time period. So if there's a moment here that we, as chairman, we shouldn't be marking this bill up, this amendment to this bill. This is one whereby I would ask the chairman that you withdraw this. We have a separate hearing on this and move this separately for legislation. And let us work in a bipartisan fashion with regard to this specific legislation. CBO has expressed great concerns with regard to the solvency. And if we're talking about a $50 benefit, a non-Medicare certified home health aide charges $19 an hour. That's 2.5 hours of labor. I mean, we're not talking about a huge benefit here. And if we're talking about charging $65 per person for a $50 benefit, we've got some issues we need to work through. And so I would ask Chairman Pallone, withdraw this, and let's move this as a standalone bill and work with both sides. And that would be my request and I yield to the chairman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
The CBO letter you're reading, we essentially responded to that by adopting, as I said, the Gregg language or something similar to the Gregg language. In other words, what they say is that it's a problem if the Secretary did not modify the program to ensure its actuarial soundness. So that's why we have that language that does, in fact, ensure the actuarial soundness and allows the Secretary to go in and make those changes. And that's exactly what was adopted in the HELP bill in the Senate.
Reclaim my time.
In order to address that concern.
Senator Gregg recognized this problem. He offered an amendment that was accepted that would require the Secretary of HHS to establish a premium rate prior to enrolling folks in the program that would ensure solvency for a 75-year period.
And that's why we have that language on page 3 that we've mentioned many times that says the Secretary can take action to make adjustments to benefits paid out and premiums collected in order to maintain program solvency and ensure the program remains deficit neutral. That's exactly what the CBO suggested in order to address the problem.
Has expired. Mr. Terry.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
May I be included in those that wish to speak after Mr. Terry?
Okay. 2 minutes. Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend Mr. Pallone for identifying an area that I think is sometimes skipped over, but
significant in the continuum of health care, and it's that period of time where people are teetering between being able to stay home and having to go to a facility, a skilled nursing or facility, or even maybe the hospital. And I believe that your focus is in the right place. I'm just curious, because here's how I see it. If you remember back to my opening statement, I talked about how part of the pay-fors for this plan is creating, quote, savings, which providers view as cuts, and we're taking a $57 billion savings to home health care. And we're replacing that piece of home health care where people go to your home and help you to stay in your home so you're not institutionalized, and now replacing that with a opt-out pay-for program. If Republicans offered cutting home health care and Medicare benefits and then replacing them with something that people had to pay for to receive again, I'm sorry, but you guys would have gone ballistic on that side of the aisle. And so now it's our turn to go ballistic in the sense that, yes, this is necessary to keep people in. It is more humane to the people who want to stay in their homes, and an incredible cost savings to us that they aren't going into an institution. But it strikes me as odd that at the same time we're trying to create this program here, that we're cutting $57 billion of home health care. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. To close the debate, Mr. Radonovich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I applaud the efforts on behalf of yourself, Mr. Pallone, in tackling a tough problem. I do have a question of counsel, a quick question. Counsel, on page 3, lines 7 through 11, it talks about the premiums collected in order to maintain program solvency and ensure the program remains deficit neutral. In a fund generated by a proposal such as this, is there any chance that it could be IOU'd like the Social Security Trust Fund?
I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand the question.
This would create a fund, and is there any chance that that fund would be IOU'd like the Social Security Trust Fund has been over the years?
Do you mean the essential purchase of Treasury bills with Social Security funds?
Meaning that the account is IOU'd and spent for something other thing? Yes.
I think we're saying the same thing.
Yes.
It's, as I understand it, there's a general rule in the Ways and Means Committee that all trust funds held by the federal government are to be invested in, they're not technically Treasury bills, I think they're called Treasury warrants, but I believe that they are all, regardless of what the fund is about, they are all invested in Treasury warrants.
So it could go into the general Treasury and be a debt later on?
The Treasury warrant has a face value, so technically the holding of the fund is still valuable. I'm trying not to say that the money is
gone. Say the word debt.
It is as if it had been invested in a Treasury bill, and that the fund held a Treasury bill during that time, which is redeemable at full faith and credit of the United States.
Much like the Social Security Trust Fund.
Yes, sir, exactly like the Social Security Trust
Fund.
Fund.
And I think you're tackling a problem that needs to be tackled. Because of the problem we have in Social Security right now, you know, we're very easily could do the same thing, and that's why I don't support it. I'll yield back.
We're now going to proceed to a vote, but Mr. Barton asked for 30 seconds.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, 40 years ago, at 11:56, equivalent to our time today on daylight savings time, Neil Armstrong became the first person to land on the moon. It's almost 40 years ago to this minute, if that clock is correct. And anybody over 40 years old in this room probably remembers exactly where you were. I was not in the hearing room on the healthcare markup, I can assure you. But that was a great occasion for all of mankind, and my hat's off to NASA and Neil Armstrong and all the heroes of that era.
We on the West Coast thought it was 8:56.
7:56.
7:56. We now proceed to a vote. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.